Well, of course, many are running the ruler over Australia's economic response to COVID-19. Some certainly now questioning, given the huge sum spent and promised to date, whether maybe we've gone a bit too big in light of the scale of the problem before us. Obviously, only time will fully answer that question. But in that space, Liberal Senator for Victoria, James Paterson, has certainly got a few people thinking with an article he wrote a couple of days ago in The Australian, where he says extraordinary times justify extraordinary measures. And in order to combat this pandemic, governments across the world have implemented restrictions unthinkable only weeks ago. But he says history shows the radical economic interventions imposed in times of crisis should be removed as quickly as possible once the crisis passes. Indeed, as Senator Paterson wrote, many of the economic interventions we've seen with COVID-19 have strong parallels in history. For example, in size and scale, and in their departure from so-called policy orthodoxy. They're comparable, he says, to the measures introduced during World War II. For example, government spending has skyrocketed, much of it funded by debt like it was in World War II. Our stay-at-home orders are akin to wartime curfews, supermarket rationing of essential goods. Well, that's reminiscent of wartime restrictions as well. So he's got a point. But as Senator Paterson says, this is the key economic point here. At the end of the war, there were many politicians and economic experts who sought to prolong the economic controls. But in fact, it was countries that returned to normal fastest, that is, those who got rid of these extraordinary measures, that were able to reap the benefits of prosperity the most in the years that followed. And I think there is the key. There are a couple of key lessons there for all of us in Australia in 2020 off the back of this coronavirus. I thought I'd pick the brains of Senator Paterson. He's on the line from Melbourne. James, good morning.
Good to speak with you, Michael.
The wartime analogy is a very good one, and particularly, as you say, at the end of World War II, there were many countries, led by many politicians, that sought to prolong the economic controls that were put in place during the war, either for political reasons or whatever. But, I mean, Britain was a prime example of this, wasn't it? I mean, Winston Churchill and the Tories basically got Britain through the war. At the end of it, they said, all right, well, look, a lot of this sort of economic modelling that was wartime economics has to go. The Labor Party under Attlee said, no, in fact, we're going to double down and nationalise everything. And the people said to Churchill, we really appreciate your efforts, but we'd like to keep a bit of this government help. Thanks very much. See you later.
That's exactly right, Michael. And look, there's no perfect analogy in history, but I think this is the closest one. It was something that affected almost the whole world, and they did extraordinary, unprecedented things. They nationalised industries, they instituted price controls, they instituted rationing and stay-at-home orders. And after the war, different countries took a different approach on how to get out of that, how to return to normal. Some countries, like West Germany, took a bit of an experiment, and they got rid of all the price controls and all the central planning that was done by government, and they prospered. And other countries, like the United Kingdom, as you said, decided the way to go after the war was to keep those controls in place, to have the government centrally manage the economy, to set the prices, to order which factories should produce what, who should work where. And it was an economic disaster for the United Kingdom that took them really 40 years to get out of. It really wasn't until Margaret Thatcher came to power and instituted her wave of reforms that they got back on a more prosperous path. But effectively, they were doing what West Germany did just 50 years later.
There is, though, before we look at West Germany, I know that's the focus of your piece, and that's why I want to talk to you. But before we move there, there is a sweet spot, though, isn't there? I mean, you're a committed Liberal, but there is a sweet spot between total state control, which is what Attlee's Labor were basically on about in Britain, and just let the market rip, which many would argue we've lately been a little bit too embracing toward. You've got to have, and we've been a little exposed here, haven't we? You've got to have enough government directive or interest in the economy so that you do have strategic industries available to convert if needed. And we've sort of, as I said, been a little exposed here because we have offshored a lot of those the last couple of decades. And as a result, they haven't necessarily been here to convert to the effort for COVID-19.
I think the basic lesson of history is that free enterprise economies are the ones that work best. Now, that's not a total free market utopia, let it rip, no regulation, no taxation, no government at all. But it is an economy where the government takes a very minimal role, where it only intervenes where it's absolutely critically necessary to do so, and it lets decisions over what our country should produce or shouldn't produce and how to do it, but largely to the private sector, because that's where the risk is taken, that's where people put their own skin in the game, and that's where, by and large, the best decisions are made about the most efficient ways we can produce things. The central planning system, when you go to its complete extreme, is what you saw in the Soviet Union, but much more moderate forms of it have existed for much of the 20th century, and by and large, they led to poverty and ruin.
Okay, let's look at West Germany, and your piece particularly focused on a bloke called Ludwig Erhard, who eventually, as some people remember, became the Chancellor of West Germany. But, of course, 1945, the war ends. Germany is physically, emotionally, economically destroyed. By 1948, June 1948, and yes, the Marshall Plan, I think by that point had started. That was a nice little pack-a-whacker to the system, as it were. But nonetheless, along comes Ludwig Erhard and says, all right, well, look, I'm going to do something very different.
That's right, and all of his advisors and all the advisors to every other government in the world were saying this is not the way to go, this is risky. Who knows what would happen if we just took away these controls and let people set prices on their own and choose how to produce things on their own. But he wanted to experiment. And you are right to point out that West Germany was a recipient of Marshall Plan aid. But what is often not remembered or misremembered by people looking back at history is that the United Kingdom received far more in Marshall Plan aid than West Germany did, as does France. So when you compare the growth rates of France and West Germany and the United Kingdom, you can draw some real lessons about what was the better model. And the evidence shows West Germany between 1950 and 1960 grew at GDP per capita rates of an average of 8.8%. France was half that, and Britain was even less still. So it really did seem to be a unique model. And of course, it has been and it was subsequently copied around the world to great success, a free enterprise economy.
So he announces the end of price controls, the end of rationing directives. I suppose it was a pretty liberalising free market model that he injected into what had been an incredibly controlled post-war economy.
Exactly, and obviously times of war do call for different things. Obviously, you do want to direct as much of the productive effort of the economy, private or otherwise, towards winning that war effort, because the consequences of not doing so are obviously so dire. But once peacetime returns, the peacetime economy should return. And I think the same analogy applies to us here. As soon as we are past the health crisis, the medical crisis that we're in, well, the world that worked for us pretty much before, it wasn't perfect, as you say, but worked pretty well, we should return to pretty quickly. There are some people already in this crisis who are saying this should be the new normal. We should keep in place all of this, and we couldn't possibly reduce government spending. But the United States is another really interesting historical example there, where they slashed government spending after World War II and then ushered in one of their most prosperous periods in history too.
Okay, so Professor Erhard in West Germany brings in the German miracle. I suppose what we need is the Australian miracle after coronavirus, because I suppose from a health point of view, we've done very, very well. Some might say we have performed a miracle, but from an economic point of view, we're going to have an enormous legacy here that people of your age and mine, we're a very similar age, are going to have to pay for the rest of our working lives. Our children and probably even our grandchildren's generation will also be paying this debt down. I don't think we'll ever pay it down, even in 3 generations. It's going to be so enormous, but you're going to have to try. And to do it, we're going to have to try to really kickstart the economy. I suppose that's what we're talking about here, isn't it? We're not talking about removing price controls and the rest of it, because we're not in that wartime economy. But we do need to try something a little new, perhaps something a little bit brave out of the back of this virus. And probably the virus has given us the opportunity, with the National Cabinet and everything else in place, to give something bold a go.
Michael, it's that debt burden that weighs particularly heavy on me. I'm a younger member of the Parliament. I have a young son, and I hope he grows up and has kids one day as well. And I couldn't sleep at night if I knew that I didn't do everything in my power to reduce at least that burden that we pass on to them, if not eliminate it altogether. And we are well on our way to $1 trillion or more of debt by some forecasts. So I thought the debt problem we had in this country before this was bad. It's going to be very serious after this. And you're right, the only way we're going to make anywhere near headway into that debt, let alone pay it back, is if we unleash really extraordinary levels of economic growth. If we just return to normal levels of economic growth, puttering along at 2 to 3%, that's not going to make a dent in that debt at all. We need to turbocharge growth. We need to unleash the economy to really deliver that. And history is very clear on this. Government-directed economies are not economies that grow the fastest. It's private sector, free enterprise economies that grow the fastest. And so the better that we can unleash them to do the good things that they do, the better off our children and grandchildren will be.
But we're going to have to do something different than we've done the last decade, which has basically been a population growth linked economic story. We're going to have to be a productivity growth linked economic story, and that's going to be a little harder for politicians to do. It's easy to say to anyone who wants to come here with a few bucks in their pocket, come here and work and buy coffees and buy cars and buy fridges and you grow GDP. But what we need to do is grow national GDP and per capita GDP, and we've been struggling to do that under the population policies we've had. And this is going to take real leadership, isn't it? I mean, we're going to have to do some pretty significant things around tax, for example, I would say, to get productivity enhancement through the roof.
We've had incredibly low productivity growth in this country for about 20 years, and I don't think it's a coincidence that that 20-year period is a period where we've done very little reform on that front. It's where there's been little reform on tax, as you say, where, in my view, we went backwards significantly on industrial relations to a much more centrally planned economy, and it has coincided with extraordinary low productivity growth, particularly low labour productivity growth. So if we don't turbocharge that, as you said, there's no way of increasing per capita GDP and delivering for our children a better lives than the ones that we have lived and delivering them a more prosperous, secure and free country than the one that we've enjoyed. And that really is the task of every generation to do that. We're going to have a harder task of doing that than previous generations because of the coronavirus, and that just means we're going to have to step up more than previous generations to achieve that.
Yeah, I mean, some of the work's been done, though, hasn't it, in that? I mean, just last year, in 2019, David Toti, the former head of Telstra, chaired a financial review, I think, on behalf of New South Wales into a lot of the taxation arrangements. There were some good ideas there. The New South Wales Treasurer, Dominic Perrottet, your side of politics, is already banging doors down saying, come on, we've got to do something about tax. Let's abolish the ineffective taxes. I think he's mentioned payroll tax and stamp duty, and you've got to compensate the states for the loss of stamp duty. So he says, well, why don't we perhaps broaden the GST or raise it to 15%? It's a more effective tax than some of those other regressive job-killing taxes. I mean, these are things that already some political leaders are talking about. Yesterday, the Victorians behind the scenes were musing about scrapping stamp duty and replacing it with a more broad sort of version of a land tax. So there is some leadership already being shown. There's a willingness already in the political class to do something here.
You're right, Michael. There is a very heavy burden that falls on the federal government to reform, but there's a heavy burden that falls on the states to reform too. And actually, if there's been an absence of reform, I think it's been particularly clear that there's been that absence at the state level. And the important thing to remember is state governments, in terms of their revenue-raising powers, actually have almost as many opportunities to do so as the federal government. And in fact, the federal government over the years has at various times offered the states more opportunities to raise revenue or to share revenue with the federal government. For example, both Malcolm Fraser and Malcolm Turnbull floated the idea of sharing income taxing powers with the states, sharing a share of it or allowing them to charge their own rate on top of the federal rate like they do in some international jurisdictions that have a federal structure like the United States, but elsewhere as well. And at almost every opportunity, state governments have said, oh, no, that's all too hard, or they've turned down opportunities to take responsibility. But one of the clear areas that we need for reform in this country is the federation. So I'm really heartened to see people like Dominic Perrottet stepping up and taking the lead on these debates. I wish him great success, and I hope that all of his colleagues in the New South Wales State Parliament realise there's nothing stopping them forging ahead on their own, whether they have the cooperation of the federal government or not. They've got the power in their hands to do it, and they shouldn't accept any excuses.
When you speak about reforming federation, I mean, one of the issues linked to that surely is duplication, isn't it? Federal-state duplication. I mean, we've got the situation, don't we, where we've got public servants in Canberra and state bureaucracies essentially doing the same thing in a whole bunch of portfolios. I mean, it's costing taxpayers who pay both state and federal taxes billions to basically have a bunch of people in ties step on each other's toes. I mean, it's crazy.
I agree. I think the federal government, by and large, for the last 60 years in this country, has taken on far too much responsibility from the states and has taken too much of an overseeing role of the states, supervising them effectively doing what they're doing. It does mean that you sometimes pay for things twice. I think that's incredibly inefficient. And the other thing about our federation is we've dropped the idea that states should compete against each other and test out and trial new ideas. And we've gone for the idea that we should harmonise things and they should do everything the same. But that really defeats the purpose of a federation. The whole point of federation is to allow different people to adopt different solutions that suit them in their particular local circumstances. That's a democratic thing to do, but it's also a great way of testing policy ideas and identifying if they work or fail. But if we go down this path of having a national curriculum where every student is taught the same thing, no matter where they are, no matter what their needs are, effectively national health system and other national systems really erodes that individual policy-making capacity of the states, and I think it's a real problem.
Just finally then, James, you've been generous with your time. Thank you for that. Just to go full circle back to West Germany where we started, as some sort of model to at least look at through a microscope and perhaps copy where we can. One of the great success stories of their 8.8% per annum economic growth over those post-war years, decade or so, was based off infrastructure. And of course there was a necessity there because the joint was flattened and you had to rebuild cities and you had to rebuild ports and you had to rebuild dams and all of that. And so, I mean, that obviously did turbocharge economic growth and gross domestic product growth. But, I mean, here we still have some infrastructure deficiencies, I would argue, particularly around the issue of water. And, of course, it's rained recently, so that whole debate around drought and water seems to have fallen off the cliff. But nonetheless, I mean, there would be an opportunity, would it not, to boost jobs, to boost incomes, to boost long-term productive capacity of this country if we did something significant and national with water infrastructure.
I agree with you. In my home state of Victoria, we haven't built a dam since the 1970s, and we all know how much Victoria and Melbourne in particular has grown that time. So the same old creaky water infrastructure is serving a massively increased population, not to mention our farming and agriculture sector and their opportunities to export that in the form of food and fibre. So it's a huge missed opportunity that we haven't done more over that period. We must do more. I think, unfortunately, in a lot of occasions, the environmental movement and green tape has got in the way of that. And so I want to see much more of it. The only caveat I would say is that those investments do have to stack up. They have to deliver their own return on investment. I don't want to see taxpayers' money being thrown away after bad projects, and everybody's got a scheme of their own or an idea of their own. Not all of them stack up, but anyone that does pass muster, that does stack up, I think we need to get behind strongly.
Yeah, I agree with you. Look, it's great to talk to you. I've taken up enough of your time this morning. Thank you for all of that, James, and we'll talk again soon.
My pleasure. Thanks, Michael.
No, my pleasure. James Paterson there, Liberal Senator for Victoria.